The Terminator has finally found a place in the military. Their formidable paired carousel along with the main tank proved to be very effective. And it was time for heavy flamethrowers. Our TOCs are much cooler than just a weapon against partisans. They have become a true weapon of victory. Let's start with the Terminators. Even in such non-parade photos of the BMPT Terminator, its fortress and combat power are evident. Two 30mm guns, ATGMs like attack helicopters, two automatic grenade launchers, additional machine guns create such a barrage of fire that the enemy cannot lift his head. The Russian military industry of the last decade has had two products, the debate about the expediency of which has resulted in a whole, sometimes even fierce polemic. The first was the Su-34 frontline bomber, or by Western classification, a heavy strike fighter. The same hell duckling that has become the main workhorse of the Air and Space Force for the past year. Now it is funny to remember how this excellent machine in different years was called morally obsolete, or an unnecessary link in the era of multipurpose aircraft. These are all quotes from pretty serious military experts with audiences of millions. All this idle talk has rolled in with the Syrian campaign, where the duckling has become the primary carrier of precision air-to-surface class weapons. And now it's kind of embarrassing to bring it up. And about the same controversy arose over the BMPT Terminator tank support vehicle. The last article where it was practically buried as a fighting platform was published less than a year ago, in a serious magazine under the name of an expert who is constantly on the federal channels. Not that we seriously question his qualifications, but we were surprised at the haste of the conclusions. This was the ideal job of guarding tank columns, but life makes its own adjustments. Main battle vehicles have long since stopped traveling in such columns, and the Terminator and the tank have made a very interesting pairing that is increasingly being used in the most brutal of engagements. And the Terminators themselves appeared and disappeared from the chronicles, although as much as we did not hear different reviews in open sources from the fighters themselves, they were all quite good. The vehicle was praised primarily for its excellent protection, even compared to the most modern Russian T-90M and T-72B3M tanks, for the diversity of its arsenal and overall firepower. Of the insistent wishes, one only heard requests to increase the caliber of the main guns to 57mm and to develop remotely detonated shells for protection against low-flying drones. Terminators, like absolutely any modern armored vehicles, were also hit, but even when immobilized, they remained intact enough to think optimistically about the fate of the crew. Generally speaking, a Terminator firing is a scary thing. When you see it, the main musical theme of the famous Hollywood blockbuster somehow starts playing in your head. By the way, there was a lot of flying into them. And they were hunted in much the same way our fighters hunted the proverbial leopards, gambling and materially motivated. By the way, quite complimentary statements about BMPT, Terminator, and on all sorts of unfriendly resources of the West, finding its layout very original, and defense is very thorough. But the fact remains that the tank support vehicle still periodically disappeared from the chronicle for months, as if it did not exist. And then suddenly re-emerged from the fog of war, smoky, hung with extra screens with the stingers of 30mm guns blackened from constant use. Here, for example, is a photo of a Terminator that has clearly seen a lot of things, lurking in the fall forest. Another one can be seen in the distance. Their use continues and it is becoming more and more meaningful. By the way, recently, thanks to some reports, we again saw the Terminator in all its glory, and even working in dangerous areas, and even in the daytime. Previously, due to good thermal imaging and generally better situational awareness of the crew, they were most often used in the dark. Usually just for infantry fire support. In fact, with no connection to the tank's performance. Now it's the other way around. As Russian tankers tell us, the Terminator is good when paired with a tank, and in the field they form a kind of merry-go-round. While the T-90M, and they work most often paired with this particular vehicle, swiftly rides out to the battlefield and begins an almost sniper-like series of shots from the 125mm cannon. BMPT Terminator maneuvering a little farther away. Due to good instrumentation and sensors, better than the Tanko view and faster reaction to threats such as a mobile ATGM calculation, on bugs and ATVs or a group of FPV drone operators. It protects the main war machine. And when it goes to reload, it goes into action itself, defending and filling with lead the places suitable for ambushes, filling with automatic grenade launchers dangerous areas of forest belts or the front edge of the enemy. It turns out to be quite effective. We've heard about this in several interviews. They once again emphasized the security of the machine. Some of them were getting several mini-drones per battle with carrots from a handheld anti-tank grenade launcher and not even getting out of it. With a certain type of projectiles, the main guns of the machine will be able to fight confidently against such a danger as kamikaze drones. The developers assure that the capabilities of the sensors and cannons allow this. Terminators, as far as we know, continue to be produced, though not in the same quantities as the T-90M is being produced and the T-72B3M is being modernized. But most importantly, the vehicle ceased to be an extra wheel in the cart and a strange intermediate link between a main battle tank and a heavy BMP. The Terminator has its own role assigned to it from birth, and it seems the basic algorithms for its use were born in the fire of combat. Hope the car is doing well now. Now for the TOCs. One recalls an almost black and white chronicle in the very early 2000s. At that time, Russian television showed for the first time the combat operation of the TOS-1 heavy flamethrower system, which uninvolved people at that time knew mostly only as Buratino. Such a fairy tale name suited this angular and misty machine based on a tank chassis, although then few people guessed that it was given because of the unusual shape of the shells, resembling the long nose of a wooden tomboy from a fairy tale by Alexei Tolstoy. After the first public use, before that there were still experimental firing during the Afghan War, the machine went into the shadows for a long time. And as is usually the case in such cases, there was a whole discussion around its appropriateness for the Russian army. The main debate was why the armed forces needed such a short-range system when most multiple rocket launchers also had their own thermobaric munitions. The need to get close to the line of contact multiplied the risks of the crew and their vehicle carrying an extremely flammable load. The fact that the TOCs would be useful in a war against a more or less equal opponent, rather than some rubber-slippered barmailis armed only with AKs, also caused doubts. However, the RHBZ troops, where the TOS-1 heavy flamethrower system was officially assigned, did not ask themselves such questions. It was originally thought to be used to decontaminate areas attacked by biological weapons, and as a firearm it was planned for extreme emergencies. As such, it could only be tested by a rather fierce war, which is what began in 2014 on the territory of Syria and northern Iraq. Here is one of the first known photos of the heavy flamethrower system from the Red Star archives. And this video of the use of TOCs in northern Iraq is one of my favorites in the history of heavy flamethrower operations. There aren't any particularly spectacular moments of covering and destroying gangster hideouts, while there are a great many such videos on the web now. But there is a sincere and characteristic reaction from Iraqi army soldiers off-screen. They had to take a big ladleful of pain and humiliation from endless defeats on the battlefield that year. And okay, it would be against a regular army. Mobile groups of radicals were chasing them through the local semi-desert. The most powerful weapons of the bandit units, besides fanaticism and high motivation, were large-caliber machine guns on pickup trucks and rare ATGMs taken from the same demoralized Iraqi soldiers. Armed with Abramses, Paladin self-propelled howitzers and other widely publicized American weapons and trained according to the best methods of the American Army. Didn't help. In short order, Mosul, Tikrit, Fallujah and other cities whose names we have memorized since Desert Storm fell. By September 2014, the advanced detachments of the outlawed ISIS were 80 kilometers from Baghdad, and foreigners were rapidly fleeing the long-suffering country, convinced that nothing could save it. And when Russian Mi-28 helicopters and incomprehensible and seemingly clumsy tracked vehicles were left as the last saviors, few believed it could make a difference. By the way, the TOCs also participated in the Syrian civil war in the assaults on Hama and the suburbs of Damascus, as well as in the second assault on Palmyra. However, the angularity of TOSA-1, Solan Sevic, turned out to be quite illusory. It is precisely because of their mobility and ability to maneuver quickly that they were able to partially compensate for their main problem, not too long range. Sunburners based on old T-72A tanks were dashing into position and firing quite accurately for unguided shells at the militants' hideouts, from which even high-precision heavy artillery could not remove them for weeks. And then groups of Iraqi commandos only had to go in where the fanatical and therefore very resilient infantry had been holding their defenses for many days. And to see not the most pleasant to look at consequences of 220mm shells of Tula NPO, Splav. That's why the Iraqi army was so happy. Thanks to the work of the TOC, who at times went out on direct targeting and inflicted a very sensitive and very demoralizing freak on the Yigilovs band in Russia. Their own losses were no longer as enormous and discouraging as they had been at the beginning of the war. The TOCs took part in virtually all major operations of the Joint Anti-Georgia Coalition and were considered the most powerful ground asset in support of ground forces. There have been several high-profile articles about the inhumanity and indiscriminate nature of heavy flamethrower systems in the U.S. Although there are several cases in which special forces from the US and Canada themselves asked Iraqi artillerymen to give them a good bang for their buck on the locations they were to go to in the combat arena. They were more comfortable that way. It is not without reason that when Baghdad declared victory over the outlawed ISIS in 2017, the TOCs participated in the victory parade over the terrorists. Despite the obvious displeasure of American advisors, and were honored with a personal mention from the lips of then Iraqi Prime Minister Haider Jawad al-Abadi, who called them one of the most important means of defeating the Bandit International. Here are the TOCs at the victory parade over ISIL in Baghdad. Now, few people would think of doubting the effectiveness of this type of weapon, which has justified itself on the fields of modern, much more intense warfare. This November may be a record for their combat use. In addition, recently, the Tosachka, a third-generation wheeled heavy flamethrower vehicle, has finally begun to be regularly featured in the chronicles, receiving rather flattering reviews. So we congratulate the units of radiation, chemical, biological defense on the previous day's holiday. 105th anniversary of this seemingly peaceful branch of the military. Military chemists are not bad guys either, and they can also burn so much that it will not be enough.